This is asteroid number 2, discovered in 1802 with the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the birth of first-wave feminists. You may also know her as Athena, Pallas Athene, or just Pallas, the warrior goddess who was born fully armoured up from her father's forehead, her father being Zeus, also known as Jupiter. She is a god of war like her brother Mars, but her war is of strategy, intelligence, rules of conduct. Her war brings the feminine element of deliberation, consultation, law, justice, and even win-win options. She's competitive, but she succeeds through skill and creative intelligence. She would definitely win Survivor, number 1 to outwit, outplay, and outsmart. Her symbol is the shield and spear, a more masculine version of Venus with the circle and cross. Remember, Pallas was born when her father's head split open. Her shield has the head of Medusa on it, as protection and a warning. Medusa was raped at her altar, and after that she became a crazed snake-haired monster who could turn men to stone with a glare. Pallas is a protective force field between feminine rage and justice. Her totem is the owl and the snake. The owl because it's wise and stealthy and sees truth even at night. The snake because it's protective, skillful, and strategic. It has victory over death because it sheds its skin. As a war goddess, Pallas is more about protection and defense than annihilation and bloodlust. She sees the pattern and finds solutions. She's about activism, politics, and raising awareness. She's an advocate, a feminist, an academic, a researcher, career woman, boss lady, lawyer, a legislator, and also a single mum in a man's world, doing what you do to keep her family together. For these reasons, Pallas shows up to expose injustice, inequality, and dishonourable conduct. So when the Ben Roberts-Smith case broke in Australian news in 2018, Pallas was all over it. Ben Roberts-Smith is Australia's best known and most decorated soldier alive. Once named Father of the Year, he met the Queen, rose to ranks of corporal. He was in charge of an elite group of SAS soldiers serving in Afghanistan between 2006 and 2012. He was awarded a Victorian Cross for it in 2010. But in 2017, there were stories gathering attention that Ben Roberts-Smith was not the hero he portrayed. In June 2018, explosive and meticulously researched reporting hit the news. Ben Roberts-Smith was directly involved in war crimes, murders of unarmed Afghan civilians, and a cult-like grip on his unit to glorify and cover up the atrocities. It was ugly, horrific, brutal. Ben Roberts-Smith had seriously gone rogue. So where was Pallas when the news broke? And we also want to have a look at Jupiter, her father, and Mars, her brother. And they're all connected with war, as well as being her close relatives. Here's Pallas. 10 degrees, nearly 11 degrees Cancer. Here's Jupiter, 14 degrees Scorpio. And Mars, 7 degrees Aquarius, is exact on the south node. Pallas is also trine Jupiter, and that could mean the truth coming out, working with the publications to expose the Scorpio underbelly. Pallas is also opposite Saturn retrograde here in Capricorn. She's nearly 11 and just over 7, so there's 4 degrees there. And this again, Pallas working with laws and restriction, and in Capricorn that can be the military, but it's also the higher institutions, the authorities and the experts, revealing where the laws were broken. The moon is in Aries, and I've set this time at midday, so the news probably came out first thing in the morning when the newspapers hit the streets, and that would put the moon squaring Pallas. We've got moon in Aries, highlighting those hidden emotions, And Aries also being the ruler of war and soldiers, violence, squaring Pallas, revealing something of that underbelly, the undercurrent. Mars conjunct the South Node is really significant because that's revealing all the toxic culture and spewing it out the other side. What was violent and brutal and out of line can't remain hidden under there. And I guess in Aquarius, Mars in Aquarius is really sharp and penetrating and brutal. It's also mob rule, a masculine cult. So what happens if we put these with Ben Robert Smith birth chart, looking at Pallas, Mars and Jupiter? Robert Smith was born on the 1st of November 1978 in Perth in Australia. We don't have a time, so I've just set it to 12 o'clock and ignore the houses. So if we start with transiting Pallas, there she is, 10 degrees Cancer, does line up with his Lilith at 12 degrees Cancer, and there's a lot of rage that can come out with that, a conflict between thinking about it and just letting rip. Lilith is also to do with whistleblowers. She's the goddess energy that refuses to accept a hypocrisy or a lie. She's prepared to stand out alone. So she's lined up with Pallas. If we go to Mars, there's Mars transiting right on the South Node. Opposite Mars, transiting Mars, there's Robert Smith Jupiter, 8 degrees Leo, right on the North Node and opposite Mars here. This transit is like the peak of reputation where you've reached the high point of something, and from here on it's got to change. It's a bit of a downturn. Jupiter starts to contract instead of expand. So this news was really having an effect on his reputation and his standing, and was uncovering the violence and the brutality. Transiting Jupiter, 14 degrees Scorpio retrograde, has lined up with his natal Uranus. And this is explosive. That's 16 degrees. Ignore the moon because we don't know the time, but he's got retrograde Venus in his birth chart at 18 degrees Scorpio. So Jupiter's in that active zone, and Uranus here just sort of implode. It sends its lightning rods and its lightning bolts down to the deep penetrating core and then explodes out from there. Retrograde Venus in Scorpio is also very secretive, very held back, split life, double life, that sort of thing. And Jupiter's here knocking on the door loudly. And in this case, Jupiter may well be representing the news and the publications, but also the law courts. A couple of other things here. Here's Mercury transiting at 21 degrees, nearly 22 Gemini. And it's at the midpoint between his natal Pallas at 26 Sag and his natal Neptune at 16 Sag. Mercury, the news, the communications, that falls right in the middle of those two places where we have justice and rules of conduct and where we have blurry lines, deception and the fog of war. The other thing that stands out here, his Chiron, 7 degrees Taurus, is opposite his Sun at 8 degrees Scorpio. And that's a really wounded, split-off self-image. Chiron in Taurus, it's the wound of the body. It's the wound of not feeling you have enough, of feeling inadequate. And so he's always got this tension going on that he has to prove himself. And with Scorpio, it's really deep sort of psychological stuff going down there. On this day that the news broke out, the nodes, 7 degrees Aquarius, South Node, and 7 degrees Leo, the North Node, was square his Sun and Chiron. That puts him in a stuck place. He can't get out of this one. His reputation is at stake. The past brutalities are exposed. And with Chiron, it's also the whistleblowers and the outsiders of the group, the ones that challenged his authority. Chiron square the nodes indicates there's a soul wound with this. So let's have a look at Ben Robert Smith birth chart. So 1st of November 1978 in Perth, and don't know the time, so it's just set for 12. Ignore the houses. Here's Pallas, 26 degrees Sag. Here are the nodes. 26 degrees Pisces and Virgo. Square Pallas. This is a big section of his life. It means there's a blind spot in his spiritual progress, and it has to do with Pallas. It has to do with justice, with rules of war, and with the feminine aspect of solving conflict through discernment, through judgment, through deliberation. In evolutionary astrology, this is called a skipped step, and you get a chance and a challenge to rectify something that you missed out in the past. Something has gone awry in Ben Robert Smith's soul path, and this is the lifetime it's called into justice. Other things to note, if we look at Jupiter, 8 degrees Leo, it is square his sun. He's got a misplaced sense of who he is, and that puts a conflict on wanting to be seen and recognised. It's a bit attention seeking. If we look at Mars, here it is just next to Mercury in Scorpio. It's very, very strong. It would be very sharp and harsh with his words, but using words minimally. And it definitely shows that kind of buff He-Man image that he's got. It could also show someone who holds resentment. So these connections to the nodes and to Jupiter, Pallas and Mars become really interesting as this case unfolds. After the story broke, in August 2018, Ben Robert Smith counterattacked, first failing in an injunction against the publications and then suing the newspapers and journalists involved for defamation. He said it was all lies. An important point right now is, at this stage, Robert Smith had a cushy executive job at a major TV network, set up by the boss Kerry Stokes, who's a multi-billionaire with huge influence. The defamation case was launched by Robert Smith against a rival network, and it was funded by Kerry Stokes. It would eventually cost $25 million. The news networks accused of defamation filed a truth defence in court, meaning they were prepared to prove in court the allegations were true. Truth was literally on trial. The case was delayed being heard for 3 years because of COVID. So between 2018 and 2021, more stories came out, inquiries were held, there was a lot of evidence stacking up. But also at this time, you've got to remember 2018 to 2021, that was the time when conspiracies were out, when Trump was in, Fox News was spreading lies, and mainstream media had really lost credibility. Journalists were attacked, some were killed, free press was under threat. But the flip side to that is the investigative reporting that really grew in that time, the fact-checking, citing and transparency that overnight became mandatory across news outlets. The truth was really literally on trial. The case was finally opened in June 2021, and it ran for 110 days and called 41 witnesses. Over that 14 months, the shocking details of murders and war crimes by Ben Robert Smith were laid out, cross-examined, and in the news. The case exposed affairs, assault, threats, and toxic warrior culture in the Australian SAS. Whistleblowers and witnesses were intimidated in a culture of silence and tribal brutality. Here's when the defamation case opened in court, and you can see Pallas and Neptune here, conjunct. Pallas exposing that fog of war, and for the whole time during this trial and the lead up, Pallas and Neptune were spinning around each other. By now, the node is 10 degrees Gemini, and the sun, it's on the same day that the sun has moved across it. This is also a highlight, a peak, an exposure. By the time the closing address happened on the 27th of July 2022, we can see Pallas has moved over the place of where the North Node was at the beginning, 10 degrees Gemini, with the Sun. That's the peak experience of that exposure through Pallas's eyes. Mars is 14 degrees Taurus, and it's pretty much on top of Uranus there at 12 degrees Taurus when the trial first began. And Jupiter is 8 degrees Aries. It's actually trining where the nodes and Juno were. It's sextile Pallas, and if we check back with Robert Smith's birth chart, the South Node is at 19 degrees Scorpio, which sits right over his retrograde Venus at 18 and close enough to his Uranus at 16 degrees Scorp. So this is a real penetrating crack right through down to the depths of anything that resembles a double life, a disregard of the feminine, and controlling relationships. At this stage, the verdict hadn't been made, but so much stuff came out because it instigated this defamation case that the defense of truth became his absolute nemesis. Just quickly, to look at the charts of what was going on some of the dates of these alleged war crimes. The first to raise attention was on Easter Sunday 2009, and I won't go into horrible details here, but the mission was dubbed Whiskey 108. Just checking in with the nodes, Pallas, Jupiter and Mars. These are the transits of that incident at Whiskey 108. There's Uranus right on Robert Smith's South Node. It's got retrograde Venus and Mars sitting in the vicinity. It's an image with a lot of ego and split off from, in this case, the feminine side because Venus is retrograde coming into it. Here's Pallas transiting at 2 degrees Cancer. It's actually opposite transiting Pluto, retrograde 3 degrees Capricorn. That's dark. That's, again, this splitting off with power and control. And if we look for Jupiter, transiting Jupiter here was 21 degrees Aquarius, snuggled up with Neptune and Chiron, and they are square Ben Robert Smith, Mercury and Mars. Again, there's this feeling of egotism, of splitting off, of separating from humanity. The other key run of events were between September and October in 2012, with Robert Smith implicated in a spate of murders on unarmed Afghan civilians. So this is just a quick look at what was going on between September and October in Afghanistan. Pallas and Uranus locked in together. They are square Pluto, 7 degrees Capricorn, and that's explosive. After a year of deliberation, the verdict was read out in court on June the 1st, 2023. As well as being found by the judge to be a murderer, Mr. Robert Smith was also found in judgment to have broken the moral and legal rules of military engagement and is therefore a criminal. His defamation case was thrown out and extensively burned, costing his TV network employer $25 million. Criminal charges may follow. The judge found that the truth had been proved. And here's the chart of that verdict being read out. We've got Pallas and Mars wide conjunct, but they're opposite his natal Jupiter. We've got transiting Neptune, 27 degrees Pisces, right on his south node, which means it's also squaring Pallas. We've got Juno, who was around at the beginning, now conjunct Pluto, 0 degrees Aquarius. Transiting Jupiter is conjunct the transiting North Node, opposite the South Node in Scorp, with the Moon moving across it. And these guys, Jupiter and the transiting North Node, are square Mars by 3 degrees. And we've got transiting Mercury, opposite his natal Uranus and that retrograde Venus in Scorpio. The truth on trial has come out. This is Pallas in action. She strips away illusion and targets the problem. She activates change with precision and upholds human dignity. the line between civilized and animalistic. Pallas is there to see the pattern and follow it to the truth. Ben Robert Smith, the former Special Air Services Regiment soldier, had broken the rules of war and disgraced his country and the army by his conduct in Afghanistan. Exactly how Pallas would sum it up. I'm Meryl Key, and this is my mystery school. If you'd like to see more of this, support my channel with a like, a follow, a share, or a subscribe. And thanks for watching. You can find me on Instagram at my_mystery school or on my website www.merylkey.com.